So let's see. Okay, so we are recording. I'm just going to introduce this half of the class. I'm Cynthia Rutz, and this is a basic program first year class, winter quarter. We are in the second half of the class, which is on Aristotle's Ethics. It's the second class on the ethics, and the assignment was to read all of book 1 for today. So tell me a little bit about what you talked about last week. I'm guessing you were just in maybe sections 1 and 2 of book 1. So you probably talked about the good as the aim of action.
Yeah, and happiness.
Okay, you got a little bit into happiness.
Yeah, towards the end.
Okay.
You know.
And you might have been shocked to discover that Aristotle thinks that politics is the master science of the good.
Yep.
And talked about that a little bit. Yep. It somehow, I think it helps when you think of that politics for them meant both the state and society. You know, so you could just say the community when he says politics, that the science of the community is the science of the good for man. So we are going to talk a lot about happiness this week. He has a few sections where he talks about other people's views about happiness. And since I know you guys read the Meno last semester, you might have found it interesting to hear that he disagrees somewhat with Plato and with the idea of the forms. And we can go back to that, but I want to jump in to Aristotle's views. And he often, by the way, starts a book like this where he says, we're going to talk about X, but first I'll talk about what's other people think about X. And so he'll give various views. And then finally you get to his view. Sometimes it's a little hard to figure out where his view begins, but I'm going to take it that his view begins in around, let's see, I'm looking at the Stephanus numbers, 1097 A15. So I'm going to take you a minute to get there. In my book, that is section 7. And I think I'm looking again to see if we have the same, roughly the same book.
We do.
Okay. Yeah. And what, Karen, what is your section 7 called?
The good is final and self-sufficient. Happiness is defined.
Okay. Yeah, we are literally on the same page. Would you begin at the beginning of that section and just read it for us, the first paragraph?
Sure. Let us return again to our investigation into the nature of the good which we are seeking. It is evidently something different in different actions and in each art. It is one thing in medicine, another in strategy, and another again in each of the other arts. What then is the good of each? Is it not that for the sake of which everything else is done? That means it is the health in the case of medicine, victory in the case of strategy, a house in the case of building, a different thing in the case of different arts, and in all actions and choices, it is the end. For it is the sake of the end that all else is done. Thus, if there is some one end for all that we do, this would be the good attainable by action. If there are several ends, they will be the goods attainable by action.
Okay, let's just pause there and ask if so far this makes sense to people. That we're investigating, you know, he's launching an investigation into the good. And he says, the good depend, different arts, different strategies have a different ends as the good. But if there were one end that covered everything we do, that would be the final good. So far he doesn't say there is a final good. He just says, if it were, that's what it would be like. So far, so good? Mm-hmm. Okay, and because he's Aristotle, not Plato, he's going to answer that question in the next section. Is there one end to the end of which we do everything else? And he thinks there is. Doris, would you pick up there and read the next paragraph?
Our argument has gradually progressed to the same point at which we were before, and we must try to clarify it still further. Since there are evidently several ends, and since we choose some of these, for example, wealth, flutes, and instruments generally, as a means to something else, it is obvious that not all ends are final. The highest good, on the other hand, must be something final. Thus, if there is only one final end, this will be the good we are seeking. If there are several, it will be the most final and perfect of them. We call that which is pursued as an end in itself more final than an end which is pursued for the sake of something else. And what is never chosen as a means to something else, we call more final than that which is chosen both as an end in itself and as a means to something else. What is always chosen as an end in itself and never as a means to something else is called final in an unqualified sense. This description seems to apply to happiness above all else. For we always choose happiness as an end in itself and never for the sake of something else. Honor, pleasure, intelligence, and all virtue we choose partly for themselves, for we would choose each of them even if no further advantage would accrue from them. But we also choose them partly for the sake of happiness, because we assume that it is through them that we will be happy. On the other hand, no one chooses happiness for the sake of honor, pleasure, and the like, nor as a means to anything at all.
Okay, so let's stop there. He asks a question and he has an answer. He says the highest good is happiness. It's the thing, if anybody says such and such is a good for them, you'd say, okay, but why do you want that thing? And he says the final answer will always be happiness. What do we think about that? Is that really true?
Well, I'm thinking maybe like a counter argument is that if I'm always pursuing my happiness, it could be to the detriment of other people's happiness. If I'm unhappy in my marriage, go and have an affair, pursue my happiness, causes great detriment to my wife. I can think of many examples where the singular pursuit of my happiness may not be a good for others.
Mm-hmm. So maybe when he says the good for man is happiness, he really means the good for a man. Your good might be happiness, but it could lead to other people's unhappiness.
And the trouble, if it's happiness for all, then I don't know what means are practically available to pursue it. If it's happiness just for me, it's not so hard for me to pursue a path to get there.
Mm-hmm.
If somehow I've got to achieve happiness for everyone, it's hard to see how that's done in practice.
Well, if we just stick with the focus as one man, and I think that's what your qualification urges us to do, even for one person, does it make sense that if you ask someone why they're doing what they're doing, what they think their goal in life is, they might say honor, they might say pleasure, they might say learning, but he says behind that is always happiness, that they want to learn because it makes them happy. They want pleasure because it makes them happy. Yeah, Karen.
So how is he defining happiness?
He hasn't yet. We're getting to it.
If he does.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Would it mean that perhaps not in the daily sense, but a man or a woman's drive in life, what they perceive to be happiness would be equated to perhaps a job or something else they're doing in their life beyond the daily norm?
Mm-hmm. So it's not going to look, you can't judge by one day. You have to ask somebody, what is your goal in life?
Yeah, because I personally don't, rarely would I, normally in just general conversation, unless you know the person really well, you normally wouldn't ask about their personal life. It's just if you're making a general conversation, it would be, well, what do you do? And you make the assumption that, well, if they're doing it because it makes them happy.
Mm-hmm. Now, you're right. This is not something we normally talk about with average people. We ask about what they do. We don't ask about what their goal is or whether they really want to be happy. Yeah, James?
I think that question of do we always do what makes us happy is an interesting one. And bunch of ways to think about that. I mean, if it makes you happy to have another dessert, fantastic. But if that's going to make you, obese and then give you a heart attack at, 32 or something, is that really a path to happiness? So that gets me thinking about, I guess there's a Freud essay of beyond the pleasure principle. And are we really motivated by our happiness? Because sometimes it looks like we make some really awful choices, and it's not always just because we don't see the long-term consequences. Even in the moment, sometimes we do stuff that just, if happiness is our goal, really, is that how we operate?
Mm-hmm.
I made some choices in my life. I look back, I go, what was I thinking? Right.
Mm-hmm. And pleasure is one of the things he says people will say is their goal. My goal is to have a lot of fun before I die. But as you point out, some of that fun can cost later. If part of the fun is eating everything you want all the time, you can get some health problems later. And is that making you happy to be unhealthy? Well, and as Karen's pointed out, we might use that word, but do we even know what it means? We might say, well, my goal is to be happy. What does that mean for you? And we're not there yet. So let's keep reading, because he is going to get there. He's going to get to a definition of happiness. Let's see, Nick, would you read the next paragraph?
Let me see which.
We're at the same conclusion?
Okay. We arrive at the same conclusion if we approach the question from the standpoint of self-sufficiency. For the final and the perfect good seems to be self-sufficient. However, we define something as self-sufficient not by reference to the self alone. We do not mean a man who lives his life in isolation, but a man who also lives with parents, children, a wife, and friends and fellow citizens generally, since man is by nature a social and political being. But some limit must be set to these relationships, for it is they are extended to include ancestors, descendants, and friends of friends. They will go on to infinity. However, this point must be reserved for the investigation later. For the present, we define as self-sufficient that which is taken by itself, makes life something desirable, and deficient in nothingness. It is happiness, in our opinion, which fits this description. Moreover, happiness is all things that one most desirable and is not counted as one good thing among many others. But if we are counted as one among many others, it is obvious that the addition of even the least of the goods would make it more desirable, for the addition would produce an extra amount of good, and the greater amount of good is always more desirable than the lesser. We see that the happiness is something final and sufficient in the end of our actions.
Okay, let's stop there and talk about what's he added by this idea of self-sufficiency. That if your goal in life is to be happy and you are happy, he wants to claim you won't need anything else. Mark, you're nodding. Do you want to say something about that? Sorry, if you do, you need to, turn your mic on, yeah.
So if your goal in life is to be happy and you are happy, then that's the end game. But if you lose control of those things that bring you happiness in the first place, like you've got to be vigilant to keep those things up that make you happy. So you can't just get complacent now that you're happy. That's all I was thinking about.
But even though it's self-sufficient, you've got to keep working on it. Well, especially because earlier he says it's an action. The good for man is action. It's something you have to work at. You have to do. Unlike, I think for a lot of modern people, they think of happiness as a state of mind. But for him, it's actions. And so I think you're right, Mark, that you got to keep, even though it might be self-sufficient, you got to keep doing the actions that make you happy to stay happy.
I kind of was looking also at the fact that he limits it. He basically defines the wife, the children, the friends of friends, but maybe I'm reading it wrong, but is he excluding those and going after some other thing that is happy?
Well, we have a not that I think helps us out. He says, by self-sufficient, I don't mean your end in life needs to be self-sufficient. I don't mean you need to live alone, because we all live in connection.
Right.
And then he starts naming some of them: parents, children, wives, friends, neighbors.
I guess where I'm going is he going for a specific sense? Surely the wife, the parents, the children, the friends of friends, the relatives will make you happy, but is he going after a specific personal happiness?
Well, and then we're back to Joseph's question earlier, that if you are in all these connections, is it possible that your happiness, that's your goal in life, could be not so happy for parents, children, wife, friends, because you're in this network of other people?
Wait, I didn't get that. Can you say that again?
Joseph raised the question earlier: if your goal in life is self-sufficient happiness, sometimes can you achieve it, but at the cost of some of these people you're connected to? So you're happy, but your happiness doesn't make your parents happy. Or you're happy, but your happiness doesn't make your wife happy.
No, I think he's saying the opposite of that. I think he's saying you can't be happy if you don't have these connections, these happy connections.
Okay.
Yeah, I thought that as well, Karen.
Okay, so by bringing up these other people, he's saying your happiness is connected to theirs.
Or somehow you've got to, through your actions, make all of those people happy, as well as yourself. Well, he says you can't live a life in isolation, and a life in isolation would be just worrying about yourself. Mm-hmm. So you also live with your parents, children, a wife and friend. There's a limit. Maybe my happiness and Karen's happiness don't need to coexist, but my happiness and my wife's happiness do.
Okay. That's the point Nick was raising earlier. There's a limit. But there is a circle. I think you're suggesting it. It certainly includes parents, children, wife, friends, that is connected with your happiness. And maybe you cannot be happy unless you're helping people in that circle be happy.
It's like they always say, you can, as a parent, you can never be happier than your saddest.
Ah, okay. That's, yeah.
I've certainly found that to be true. So.
Mm-hmm.
The next bit is interesting too, because then he says, well, you have to draw a line somewhere, because maybe to paraphrase that, you can't make all the people happy all the time.
Yes.
And that kind of brings up that notion of, your moral circle, like who or what do you include in your moral circle? And that's an interesting point, is that can it go on forever or can't it? I mean, can you include plants and flies and stuff, or do you have to say, no, just my children and my spouse or something, Mm-hmm. Where do you draw that limit?
And he does say he's going to talk about that later, where you draw the limit. But here he just proposes that there is a limit.
It would be, I just had a thought, we've just been doing a lot of discussion on war and enemies. And I suppose this is a fairly compatible philosophy if you want to be, a warmonger. Because if you can draw the line with your people, your enemy's happiness doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. So going back to Herodotus, Cyrus would be obviously wanting to be happy. He'd be wanting the Persians to be happy, but he wouldn't be too concerned with the happiness of the Greeks.
Mm-hmm. No, good point. And so we'll have to stay tuned with interest to see how far Aristotle thinks that circle goes. Does it stop at the state? Yeah, Karen?
Well, I also keep thinking about that bit in the Herodotus where Solon says, Croesus asks him who's the happiest, and he, says all of his examples are debt, because you can't
Mm.
be perfectly happy unless your ending is also a good ending.
Mm-hmm.
Which sort of seems the opposite of Aristotle then. Aristotle is only saying happiness is in the here and now.
Actually, stay tuned, Karen, because he brings up Solon. This is one of those rare instances where the two texts kind of converge for you this week, because he in just a page, he's going to be bringing up Solon and talking about, but do you have to wait until the end of somebody's life to declare them happy? And you can't say they're happy until you know how things end. He keeps bringing up Priam, who had a terrible ending to his life. I mean, at the age of 80, you might have said, look, Priam, what a happy guy. His children's children are surrounding him. The city of Troy is thriving, but then the city of Troy is destroyed, and he watches his children slaughtered in front of him. And it's a terrible ending. And so even Aristotle says you cannot call him happy when he has an end like that. So yeah, and that factors in here for sure.
So is that then saying that happiness, is he not defining happiness necessarily as a feeling? I mean, you sort of touched on this before, what Mark said, that it's more of an action.
Definitely an action for him. Yeah. He talks a little later about you can't be happy when you're asleep because you're not doing anything. Although he says that it is true the dreams of good people are better than the dreams of bad people, but happiness is an activity for him for sure. Well, then let's go on, because within a page we are going to get his definition, and then we can kind of struggle with it.
Excuse me.
Sorry.
Sorry. When you say
Mark.
you can't, when he says you can't be happy when you sleep, but if you sleep properly, then you're happy all the next day, and if you don't sleep properly, then the next day can be miserable.
Yes. And he doesn't get into that, whether, the contribution of sleep to happiness. But he does say that because it's an activity for him, it's not a thing that can continue when you're sleeping. Once you wake up and start acting again, then if you slept well, maybe you're acting well. And if you slept poorly, maybe not so well. And this is very different from, you're right, modern definitions of happiness are often very psychological. It's about a state of mind. It's not about action. Karen, go ahead.
I was just going to tease Mark. I said, if you get up at 4 a.m, you're a hero. That's all.
Okay.
Talk about lack of sleep.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, let's go on, because in the next part, he does get into this idea of why does happiness have to be active for him? Why does he keep emphasizing that? Let's see, Joe, you haven't read yet. Would you read for us the very next paragraph, to call happiness the highest good?
Sure. To call happiness the highest good is perhaps a little trite, and a clearer account of what it is still required. Perhaps this is best done by first ascertaining the proper function of man. For just as the goodness and performance of a flute player, a sculptor, or any kind of expert, and generally of anyone who fulfills some function or performs some action, are thought to reside in his proper function, so the goodness and performance of man would seem to reside in whatever is his proper function. Is it then possible that while a carpenter and a shoemaker have their own proper functions and spheres of action, man as man has none, but was left by nature a good for nothing without a function? Should we not assume that just as the eye, the hand, the foot, and in general each part of the body clearly has its own proper function, so man too has some function over and above the functions of his parts? What can this function possibly be? Simply living? He shares that even with plants, but we are now looking for something peculiar to man. Accordingly, the life of nutrition and growth must be excluded. Next in line, there is a life of sense perception, but this too man has in common with the horse, the ox, and every animal. There remains then an active life of the rational element. The rational element has two parts. One is rational in that it obeys the rule of reason, the other in that it possesses and conceives rational rules. Since the expression life of the rational element also can be used in two senses, we must make it clear that we mean a life determined by the activity as opposed to the mere possession of the rational element. For the activity, it seems, has a greater claim to be the function of man.
Okay, let's pause there. It's he almost feels like he's talking like a biologist here. You know, that for every creature, we look about what's their proper function. You know, what's a good horse? What are the things that lead to the proper functioning of a horse? Or for, you know, what's a good shoemaker? And he says, so there must be something like that for man, where you say, what's the proper function of a man? So let's talk a bit about that, because that seems to be why he's stuck on the idea that happiness is about function and activity. It's not about feeling.
Well, I can sort of see where that's heading in terms of, you know, if we can just find the function and find the end of what something is for. But on the way there, this reminds me of those of us that read Meno, you know, come into the notion of, well, you know, what's virtue, as opposed to here are a bunch of virtues. And then Socrates and Meno have this thing about, you know, well, you just give me a swarm of bees, and what's really the essence of the swarm. And they never get there, because whenever you try to pin something down, of course, the edges start to disappear as you look closely at them. And then here he started doing that very cavalierly, like saying, well, you know, humans are completely distinct from everything else. It's just without really giving that a thought of like, oh, really? I mean, you know, are these things as clear cut as that? And he sort of moves through that pretty quickly, maybe assuming that the lines are really clearly separated.
Mm-hmm. Well, and since he does bring up other animals, let's talk about that. He says, it can't be that just living is the proper function of man, because we share that with plants. You know, plants just live. They take in food and water and they grow, and that's fine. But if you see a man who does that, or just a human being, there he is, he's eating, he's drinking, he's taking in nutrition, he's growing, he's saying, yeah, but that's not the proper function of a man. I mean, you have to do that. You die if you don't. But I'm not going to look at that, and I'm not going to look at someone who does that and say, now there goes somebody who's fulfilling the proper function of a man, right?
I guess I would say even with the plants. I mean, we know now today that plants talk to each other a lot, and they take care of their young, and you know, they're very dynamic and social and communicative, and you know, it's of course looking with, you know, modern science as hindsight to go, these categories aren't all that clear. So it's sort of, if you don't look too hard at the edges, I think they are.
Mm-hmm. Well, so you're saying that maybe nowadays we'd say maybe even trees have this active life of the rational element. It's just a little harder to spot. And a community. Mm-hmm. You're right. There's new modern studies that are showing the roots of trees linked under the ground and networks, and that they're actually communicating with each other.
Right, exactly.
But one thing he does say about men is it's not enough just to possess that rational element. It needs to be activated for you to be fulfilling your proper function. And we're back to, so while you're sleeping, your reason is sort of deactivated, and maybe you're not fulfilling your proper function. Though we need to sleep and eat.
So basically, he's just basically saying you have to do something. You have to perform something. Otherwise, there's no way you could be happy.
And happiness is starting to look like, for him, it's tied to the proper function of a human being. You're also not functioning properly as a human being.
Yeah, there has to be a purpose. You've got a life. You have to live it. you have to do something for it.
Mm-hmm.
I think that action idea, that happiness, that's not a bad idea, I think.
Mm-hmm.
But to reason it out by way of this process of stepping through and saying that this is different this is what makes man distinct from the animals. Because I think that animals also could enjoy happiness through function and activity as well.
Mm.
So I don't know if this argument persuades me.
Mm-hmm.
And also, what does he mean by the rational element? I mean, does he mean consciousness? Does he mean thinking? Because in the next paragraph, he says right away that there's a soul. There's a soul. So he doesn't mean that the rational element is your soul. Your soul is working with the rational element. So
Mm-hmm. Well, and this is a case where he's a little backwards, because you might have noticed the very last paragraph. I'm sorry, the very last section is where he goes into the parts of the soul. And only part of the soul is rational. He says there's a part of our soul that's irrational. There's a part that's just this nutritive part, that seeks food. So even if, and a lot of this is kind of confirmed by modern brain psychology, right? That there's parts of our brain that are just really basic about food and water. And even if other parts aren't functioning, we'll maybe stumble to water and drink it because that part is still functioning. So one way of thinking about his version of the soul is to just say our mind or our consciousness. I think you're right, Karen. And part of that is rational and reasonable, but part of it is desiring and wanting. And part of it is this nutritive part. I need to eat, I need to drink. He gets into that, like I said, a lot in the last section.
that's the.
All right, guys. See you later.
Sorry? Joseph and then James? Oh, I'm sorry. He was saying goodbye. Okay.
Yes.
Okay, you guys are used to that. Okay, and James, you were just waving.
Yep.
Sorry.
So you're saying he's like dividing it up like Freud, ego, superego, and id? Is that?
Actually, Freud kind of got it from him.
Okay.
This idea that
right. He was first.
Yeah. But we could take a quick diversion into chapter 13, and you'll notice our translator actually brings in Freud by the back door by calling chapter 13 the psychological foundation of the virtues. Aristotle never uses the word psychology. It hasn't been invented yet. But he does say the soul has parts, and I'm looking to see where he outlines them nicely. Maybe somewhere around 30. So 1102b30, where he says, thus we see that the irrational element of the soul has two parts. The one is vegetative and has no share in reason at all. And that's just the part, eat, drink. There's some part of our brain that says we have to eat and drink. The other is the seat of the appetites and of desire in general, and partakes of reason insofar as it complies with reason and accepts its leadership. And then a little later, he's going to say, and then there's the part that is rational. So it sounds like, working backwards to what he says is the proper function of a man. He says, a man is not functioning properly unless the reason part of his soul is in charge. If you're just operating on desires, or if you're vegetative, you're eating and drinking, you're not fulfilling your proper function as a human being, because you've got this other part that you're not using, this rationality. But yeah, you'll notice he doesn't by soul mean the later Christian idea of a soul. It's just sort of the conscious part of you, and what are the pieces of it. Well, let's go on. He's going to pursue this idea of the proper function being tied to reason, and that's going to become part of his definition of happiness. So let's pick up right where we left off back at, let's see, 1098a, around 10, the proper function of man then. And let's see, Bonnie, had you read yet? Would you read for us?
Sure.
The proper function of man, then, consists in activity of the soul in conformity with a rational principle, or, at least, not without it. In speaking of the proper function of a given individual, we mean that it is the same in kind as the function of an individual who sets high standards for himself. The proper function of a harpist, for example, is the same as the function of a harpist who has set high standards for himself. The same applies to any and every group of individuals. The full attainment of excellence must be added to the mere function. In other words, the function of the harpist is to play the harp. The function of the harpist who has high standards is to play it well. On these assumptions, if we take the proper function of man to be a certain kind of life, and if this kind of life is an activity of the soul and consists in actions performed in conjunction with the rational element, and if a man of high standards is he who performs these actions well and properly, and if a function is well performed when it is performed in accordance with the excellence appropriate to it, we reach the conclusion that the good of man is an activity of the soul in conformity with excellence or virtue, and if there are several virtues, in conformity with the best and most complete.
And go on just a sentence or two more, because here's where we get the solon element.
But we must add, in a complete life, for one swallow does not make a spring, nor does one sunny day. Similarly, one day or a short time does not make a man blessed and happy.
Okay. So we actually have a definition. Remember, Plato kind of beats around the bush about the definition of virtue, but we actually get one from Aristotle. What is the good of man? It is an activity of the soul in conformity with excellence or virtue. And if there are several virtues, in conformity with the best and the most complete. But now let's unpack that.
So he's saying that a virtue is a standalone thing?
He hasn't yet claimed. I remember James was reminding us of Meno that some of Meno's definitions made Socrates say, you haven't defined virtue, you've given me a list of virtues, like a swarm of virtues. And Aristotle's not yet deciding whether it's one virtue or many. He says either way. The good man is the one who's is activity of the soul in conformity with virtue or virtues. At the moment, he's willing to leave that undecided. Is it one or is it many?
Well, what seems strange to me is in conformity with. So that's like, to me, means like bending yourself to some, you're conforming to something that exists.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting choice of words. And let's go back to his example of the harpist. Right? I mean, a harpist plays the harp, but we're not just looking for a harpist, we're looking for a harpist with high standards. And that's one who plays it well. And so he says, if you're looking at not just an average human being, but a really good human being who is exhibiting the proper function of a human being, his soul will be in conformity with excellence or virtue. Just as the harpist, I'm trying to think of I'm thinking about the difference between a good harpist and just a harpist.
I can tell you as a professional musician that a really good harpist can be a very unhappy person.
Ah. So being a good harp player and being happy, no connection. But what has that good harpist got that just the regular harpist doesn't? What is that? He talks about setting high standards.
No, they have drive and they have talent. But Dr. Suzuki says excellence in music is 1% talent and 10,000 repetitions. So they have drive.
Mm-hmm.
But that's
well, and so it's interesting he chose flutist, because you're telling us flutist, you want to be a good one, a lot of action. It's not just an idea in your head, it's like practice, practice, practice. The
Yeah.
old line about you want to get to Carnegie Hall, right? How do I get to Carnegie Hall? Practice, practice. So set high standards, but also act on those standards.
Right.
Practice, practice, practice. And that's for the excellent harpist. And so for the excellent human being, is that then similar to this idea of whose activity of the soul is in conformity with excellence? Which maybe means practice, practice, practice here too. You want to be an excellent human being? It's going to take a lot of work.
But for a musician, you know what you have to practice.
Mm.
It's very clear what you have to practice, whereas for a human being, that's less clear.
Mm-hmm.
But that's interesting because, I mean, as a musician, how do you know what to practice? I mean, is it because other people have achieved greatness in that instrument and therefore the path has been kind of established by others? I mean, if that's true, I wonder if that applies here. What you could say is, what does it mean to put in the reps to become an excellent human?
Mm-hmm.
We'll see what other excellent humans have done and kind of put in the reps like they did.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not just that, if you're using the example of music, because you can hear if you're out of tune or not. You don't need an example to know that you're out of tune, and you can feel if you're playing arrhythmically, and you know if you're bringing off your musical intentions by the reaction of your audience. So, I mean, yes, it's an important part of training and life to listen to the great musicians, but a lot of it is, I think, internal. Your instructors give you tools to reach those goals, but knowing those, you can only be a really good musician if you internally can hear those things.
Mm-hmm. Well, and you're reminding me of a caution he gave early on. We skipped over it, but you might have remembered back in section 3 when he talks about the limitations of ethics and politics. He says, young men need not apply. And I guess we can add young women to that because they're not yet good judges. Around 1095A, he says, and I'm just going to use young person. For that reason, a young person is not equipped to be a student of politics. For he or she has no experience in the actions which life demands of him or her. And these actions form the basis and subject matter of the discussion. Moreover, since a young person follows their emotions, the study would be pointless and unprofitable. For the end of this kind of study is not knowledge, but action.
Excuse me.
Yeah, Mark.
So it seems like we're always comparing people, like, you know, a young person can't be a judge of this because they're too young, they haven't lived enough, blah, blah, blah. So, you know, we're always going to compare someone to someone else to have a metric for what's a good life. So there's always going to be like a good life and a bad life.
Well, I wonder if you're comparing someone else, or I'm picking up Karen's point that you have to have played a lot to know when you're off. I'm back to the musician. Like you're practicing, but you know you've done this enough times that you know when something's off. You can judge. You're not in conformity with the best. I mean, maybe one of the strings of your harp is untuned, and you know that because you've played this piece so many times, or your rhythm is off or something. And I'm wondering if, because I'm really landing, Karen, on you're making us pay attention to that word conformity. How do you know if you're in conformity with excellence of virtue? And it kind of sounds like he's saying, for one thing, you have to have done it for a while.
So he's saying that there's no shortcut.
Maybe.
That you're going to, if you really want to be the absolute best, you're going to have to practice. You're going to have to show activity, that you just can't, in a parlance of being a musician, play a few times and expect to be an expert and gain the happiness there attained. Or in a life, you've got to live life long enough to be able to look back and say, well, now based on everything else, I am happy.
But I think Mark is maybe arguing from the point that I think probably you're the youngest of us, that seems unfair to say that a young person can't.
Oh, well, and you know what? I should have read on, because he makes clear it has nothing to do with how old you are. So this is, I stopped reading too soon. So this is back on 1095A5. It talked about it will be pointless and unprofitable. Whether he is young in years or immature in character makes no difference. So it sounds like he's saying we can all imagine a 65-year-old who is immature in character and therefore is not going to be able to conform the activity of her soul to excellence or virtue. Even at 65, they're too immature. And maybe to Mark's point, somebody at 15 might be plenty mature to do it. Yeah, Mark, go ahead.
I'm just confused because we have this idea of excellence of virtue. So for you to be excellent, someone else has to be subpar, right? So therefore, we can't all be excellent. So then we can't all be happy. Is that what it's sort of getting at all?
Well, I guess this brings up the harpist example, because he, and I think he chooses his examples carefully. There are some people, and I'm going to say this, Karen, you can tell me if I'm wrong, that could really try hard and practice, but there's still that 1% that they ain't got. And they are not going to become an excellent harpist, no matter what.
Absolutely.
You agree that there's some, and so I think it's still an open question. Is he going to claim that with regard to virtue, there's some people that cannot conform their soul to the excellences of virtues, try as they may? Or is he going to say, you know what, we can all do it with enough practice? It's the function of a human. We've all got the equipment. It's not about playing a harp. It's about playing our reason. So it's an open question, I think, still to ask, can we all do it? Can we all become excellent human beings? Or is it like the harpist, where there's something you got to have to start with, and if you don't have that, practice isn't going to get you there.
But I do want to say about the practice. If you lack the 1%, you're never going to be excellent, but you can be really pretty good.
Okay.
So, really pretty good.
Yeah. Well, and maybe when it comes to excellence or virtue, most of us would be, if you think of our kids, if your kid's really pretty good, if they practice virtue a lot, but never attain excellence, would we feel like, well, they're a really, really pretty good person, and that's good enough.
I gotta go, guys. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Thanks, Karen.
Bye.
Yeah, the musical example I think really helped here, by the way. Now I'm maybe giving away something to add, that the next chapter is going to talk a lot about habit. So not practice, but I think that's the same idea, that he is going to make the claim that this takes work, just the way becoming an excellent flutist takes work. And that habit is a big part of it. But I guess I want to ask you, with this definition, can you think of anybody you know about whom you would say, that is one excellent human being that I know? I don't know if you would define it and say, because the activity of their soul is in conformity with virtue. Most of the time, or almost all the time, or ever since you've known them. I guess I'm partly wondering, are we decent judges of this? Do we know some people in our lives who we'd say, that is one excellent human being? And if so, do you want to describe them to us and say why? James, you got a candidate?
Well, as I start to think about it, that's a really excellent question. I mean, the first person that comes to my mind is my partner. She's a really wonderful human being, and just thoughtful and kind, and takes great care of those that she works with and lives with me. But I worry about her because I'm like, well, wait a minute, take care of yourself. I mean, at some point, being a really excellent person can tip to the pathological, right? I mean, if you're going to be an excellent caretaker, that can be tend into dependency and codependency and all kinds of things. So I mean, immediately when you ask it, I think, sure, I know a handful, and then I think about them. I go, well, wait a minute, those good qualities sometimes aren't always good qualities. It's contextual sometimes. So it's not, yeah, it's not easy.
Mm-hmm. And it might turn out when we look, because he is going to give us a list of virtues, we may find that some of the virtues include moderation. So, a lot of books about this talk about you got to learn to say no too.
Right.
It's great that you help and you nurture but you also need to turn some of that help and nurture on yourself.
So you have to be extremely good at being moderate.
Yes. No. But now let's ask about this business he adds, because he's read Herodotus and he knows about Solon. He quotes him, I think, a little later, that maybe you need to add to this definition that the person does it in a complete life. So maybe, now we're back to Mark's critique. He'd look at a 15-year-old and say, you look like you're an excellent human being right now, but I want to see you at 30 when life has thrown a few things at you. What do you think about the fact that he's unwilling to say for sure that a person is an excellent human being unless he's looking at a somewhat complete life? Why would he add that caveat? Yeah, Mark?
Well, there's just still more to tell until someone's dead. Basically, you don't know what's left in the story.
Mm-hmm. So their story's not finished, for one thing. Yeah.
Well, is it easier to be an excellent person when you're younger because you're not faced with all, like, some of the hard decisions you have to make as you age, or some of the circumstances that you're put in as you grow?
Yeah, and especially I think people would cite old age when your body starts to fall apart. How do you react? Are you still able to be, in conformity with excellence or virtue, or do you start complaining and become self-centered and Well, another thing he brings up later that causes him to actually even modify this definition more is outside things, because he says a lot of people would say, well, there's a person whose soul is in conformity with excellence or virtue, but what if they have the problems of Job? Their kids die, their parent dies, they lose their property, their skin breaks out. Are you still going to call them happy and blessed? Don't external factors matter? And he brings that up in the next section, or it might be, it's next section, to 8. And let's take a look at that, because it does seem to cause him to modify, or at least consider modifying his definition. So 8 is called Popular Views About Happiness. But I want to jump to the end, where he talks about the need for maybe external goods to be happy. And this is at 1099b, a little before the 30 above it. He says, still happiness, as we have said, needs external goods. Are people there? James, would you read that for us?
Yes. Still, happiness, as we have said, needs external goods as well. For it is impossible, or at least not easy, to perform noble actions if one lacks the wherewithal. Many actions can only be performed with the help of instruments, as it were, friends, wealth, and political power. And there are some external goods, the absence of which spoils supreme happiness. For example, good birth, good children, and beauty. For a man who is very ugly in appearance or ill-born, who lives all by himself and has no children, cannot be classified as altogether happy. Even less happy, perhaps, is a man whose children and friends are worthless, or one who has lost good children and friends through death. Thus, as we have said, happiness also requires well-being of this kind. And that is the reason why some classify good fortune with happiness, while others link it to virtue.
Okay, so let's talk a bit about that. He's defined the excellence of a human being or happiness as an activity of the soul, which makes it sound internal. But there's a lot of external things that can go wrong. And he seems to list some things that he feels like you need. Friends, wealth, political power.
And several of those things strike me as things that an individual can't control, like a good birth. You know?
Yeah.
It's like, let me arrange to get born to Bill and Melinda Gates. You know?
Or beauty.
Right.
Yeah. And good children. You know, you might be very happy. You might have chosen a spouse well and find work you really like, and then you have kids, and you have bad kids. Earlier, someone said that you're only as happy as your saddest kid. And what if your kids are really troubled? Can you really be happy? Even though you maybe can't control that. And I guess I wonder what you think about his idea that even when you think about it as an activity, he says some actions need the help of instruments. And he lists friends, wealth, and political power. So what about that idea of you're trying to be a good person, you're trying to be in conformity, have your actions be in conformity to virtue, but he says, yes, but some of those actions need an instrument. Do we agree?
Well, to show your happiness and your goodness as an activity, it's not an activity unto yourself. You need to participate in society in some way. I mean, any action you do is something that you do within society, in the community. So I would think, you know, whether it's an action and your compassionate and caring of your friends and take care of them, whether or not you have wealth, but you know, the actions toward your friends or your family. I think you can't operate in a vacuum. Going back to what he said about being self-sufficient, that didn't mean being alone in isolation. You had to exist within a community. And I think this is just a further explanation of what that community is that you have to act within.
Okay. So we wouldn't say that Robinson Crusoe was happy. You have to take away his Man Friday, I guess. But if he's alone on an island, no instruments, no friends, no wealth, no power. So I gather Aristotle would say he can't really be happy. You need activity. You need to be actively virtuous. And without other people, what are you doing? I guess you could, you know, back to James' idea earlier that maybe we've expanded our idea what your community is. You know, maybe you could bind up the wound of a seagull that, you know, hurt itself on a rock, and there you are being virtuous. Tom Hanks made a friend of a was it a volleyball? Maybe because he did sense that you need something to act on or talk to or work with.
Is that the same with people with multiple personalities then?
Sorry, could you say that again, Mark?
So if someone's got multiple personalities, is that like an expression of that?
I don't know. I mean, are they? So then you if you were on an island alone, but you had multiple personalities, could you then still be happy because you could be friends to each of your personalities? Maybe. Yeah. Well, let's look at him and how he then modifies his definition a little bit to take into account these external things. And I'm now looking at section 10, where he's and he really does quote Solon here at the beginning of 10. Can a man be called happy during his lifetime? Second sentence, he says, must we, as Solon would have us do, wait to see his end? He talks about that for a while. And then he talks about the importance of sort of stability and permanence with regard to happiness. And but I want to look at the last 2 or 3 paragraphs because he seems to give yet another definition that now takes externals into account. So this is at 1101A. If, as we said, the activities determine, that's where we were. I don't think, Mark, have you read for us yet? Would you mind reading that? If, as we said?
I don't have the book yet. Sorry, it's still coming in the mail.
Oh, okay. That's okay then. Doris,
Thanks.
would you pick up there? If, as we said?
If, as we said, the activities determine a man's life, no supremely happy man can ever become miserable, for he will never do what is hateful and base. For in our opinion, the man who is truly good and wise will bear with dignity whatever fortune may bring, and will always act as nobly as circumstances permit. Just as a good general makes the most strategic use of the troops at his disposal, and a good shoemaker makes the best shoe he can from the leather available, and so on with experts in all fields. If this is true, a happy man will never become miserable. But even so, supreme happiness will not be his if a fate such as Priam's befalls him. And yet he will not be fickle and changeable. He will not be dislodged from his happiness easily by any misfortune that comes along, but only by great and numerous disasters, such as will make it impossible for him to become happy again in a short time. If he recovers his happiness at all, it will be only after a long period of time in which he has won great distinctions. You're on mute.
Sorry.
Okay.
Would you continue the next paragraph? Because there he gives his new definition that includes externals.
Okay. Is there anything to prevent us then from defining a happy man as one whose activities are an expression of complete virtue and who is sufficiently equipped with external goods, not simply at a given moment, but to the end of his life? Or should we add that he must die as well as live in the manner which we have defined? For we cannot foresee the future, and happiness, we maintain, is an end which is absolutely final and complete in every respect. If this be granted, we shall define as supremely happy those living men who fulfill and continue to fulfill these requirements, but blissfully only as human beings. So much for this question.
Okay, so where does this leave us with the impact of externals then? How important are they to happiness? Or to human excellence? Yeah. Doris?
To the extent that they interfere in the happiness, that there is something that occurs that is detrimental to your, well-being, such as, the death of a child, or, something that would negatively impact upon your happiness, may not be done directly to you, but to someone around you.
Mm-hmm. Well, and he also talks about, he brings up the example of the shoemaker again, right? To be an excellent shoemaker, but then if you don't have the leather available, you make the best shoes you can from the leather you have. And I guess I wonder how far does that apply to happiness or excellence, that here you are, an excellent human being, living according to a rational principle, trying to be virtuous, but you don't have much. Maybe you lost some family members, maybe you lost your job, you don't have much material wealth, so you can't be very generous. Would he still say you're happy or you're excellent?
I would say that based on your example of a shoe, or rather Aristotle's, that you're excellent in spite of everything else, and you're still making the best shoe available, even though you don't have all the resources.
Mm-hmm.
You're finding it within yourself to put aside all your personal preferences and all the different things that drain you, and your concentration solely is on making the best shoe possible. And in that virtue, you find happiness. Am I saying it right?
Yeah. Okay.
But
And
yet at the same time, the shoemaker has to have some leather.
yeah.
Right. I mean, it's not saying, okay, well, maybe I don't have the best leather. Let me see what I have around the shop. All right, I got some I can make. But I guess I see that going the next step. Well, if he has no leather at all, if the shop is truly empty of leather, then he can't make a shoe at all. So now he can't perform his function, his proper function.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems like there must be some minimum level of external stuff that one has to be an excellent human, if that maps directly onto the shoemaker analogy.
Mm-hmm. Well, and then maybe that's where Priam comes in, because here's a man who might have lived a pretty virtuous life up until he loses his city and his children. You know, he sees them die in front of him. And he says, but he's unwilling to say that's the final word. He does say, you know, he'll not be dislodged from his happiness easily, but only by great and numerous disasters, which sometimes happen, that will make it impossible for him to become happy again in a short time. If he recovers his happiness at all, it will only be after a long period of time. So he does seem to, you know, you're right, the shoemaker cannot make a shoe at all if there is no leather. Is he saying, though, that an excellent human being, even if they're loaded down with misfortunes, really terrible misfortunes, it could be impossible to be happy again in a short time, but he seems to want to still claim, but eventually they could recover their happiness?
Well, maybe what that means is that the leather is life, because as long as you have some time, as long as you have some life left, you can still bounce back, you can still recover. Whereas I guess maybe in Priam's case, that wasn't, you know, he didn't bounce back from the fall of Troy. But given the time, I think he's suggesting you can.
Mm-hmm.
But then what does he mean by in which he has won great distinctions?
Yeah.
I mean, where does that, how would that apply to a shoemaker? I guess I'm just a little confused on what he means in which he has won great distinctions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What kind of distinctions? So picture the person, a person in your life who you think is a really, you know, excellent human being. He says they won't be dislodged. If they really are excellent, they won't be dislodged easily. But if great and numerous disasters happen, they might be really unhappy for a while. But if they recover, it will be after a long period of time in which they have won great distinctions. Yeah, that's the phrase. What does that mean? How will you know that they've recovered their happiness? What does he mean by distinctions? Especially because that sounds like honor, right? External. I mean, distinction is something you gain from other people.
Is the distinction perseverance? That if you really have a rough patch and you hang in there until you're happy, then people go, wow, look at that. He really endured a lot. Give him some kleos, give him some glory, honor.
Mm-hmm. Well, and we can think of stories we've heard in the news of, say, parents who've lost a child under terrible circumstances, and they create a foundation. They out of that grief, they make something positive, and that might be that kind of a distinction. That maybe for a while they have to wallow in the grief because they just can't function. But when they can function again, they maybe are able to make something good out of a terrible thing. And that might be a distinction. But, you know, back to Mark's earlier point, I think this might be the point at which we'd say, but not everyone can do it. You know, back to our, does that really excellent harpist need to have something in them to begin with? Because aren't there people who would just fall under this? You thought they were an excellent human being, but then misfortunes come their way and they cannot come back. They just wilt.
Yeah, it's like the notion of that which does not kill you makes you stronger, but
Mhm.
yet there is such a thing as PTSD. So at some point, you know, an individual's had all they can bear.
Mm-hmm.
So if that's something intrinsic, again, you can't control, is that part of a good birth, you know, kind of your genetic lottery that you have as an external?
No.
Is Aristotle saying that that the pursuit of happiness and the ability to obtain it basically underlies everything, that because you've performed well over a period of time, that if you're beset with problems and the vicissitudes of life, that you're able to recoup and move past it simply because you've had the ability of having a habit of pursuing happiness. So it's easily gained back after a point in time, and you're able to resume your former happiness. Don't know if that's remotely what anybody's thinking, but I just thought I'd bring that out.
Yeah, I think you're right. I'm looking for an earlier passage where he talks about the stability of happiness, and I think you're right. It's based on the fact that you got it through. He doesn't yet use habit. He's about to use that word a lot next reading, but it has to have a kind of stability. It can't just be something people praise you for. You know, he says honor is nice, but it's external. Yeah, he does talk about stability a lot on page 25. Let's maybe pick it up there. And it begins actually, I'm sorry, my pages are different from here. 1100B in section 10. And it's a paragraph that begins, but we must return to the problem. Nick, are you there?
But what we must return to the problem and
Yeah.
raise earlier?
Yeah, this
Yes,
gets into this
yes.
question of permanence that might address what you just said. So go ahead if you would.
But we must return to the problem raised earlier, for through it our present problems perhaps may be solved. If one must look to the end and praise a man not at being happy, but as having been happy in the past, it is not paradoxical that at the time when a man actually is happy, this attribute, though true, cannot be applied to him. We are unwilling to call the living happy because changes may befall them, and because we believe that happiness has permanence and is not amendable to changes under any circumstances. Whereas fortunes revolve many times in one's lifetime, for obviously it is, for obviously if we are to keep pace with man's fortune, we shall frequently have to call the same man happy at one time and wretched at another, and demonstrate that the happy man is a kind of chameleon, and that the foundations of his life are unsure. Or is it quite wrong to make our judgment dependent on fortune? Yes, it is wrong, for fortune does not determine whether we fare well or ill, but is, as we said, merely an accessory to human life. Activities in conformity with virtue constitute happiness, and the opposite activities constitute its opposite.
Okay.
Question.
Well, let's
Okay.
stop there.
Okay.
So is that the kind of permanence that you had in mind, Nick?
Yes, where you basically, I'm getting a lot of reverberation. you basically, because you've already been happy and you know what it takes to be happy, when something befalls you, it may knock you off your happiness for a while, but you've already been there. So you're able to basically say, well, yeah, I've been happy before. You can then find it. But if you've never been happy, how would you know you're happy or not? But I don't know. Maybe I'm going a little off on the deep end. I don't know. In other words, the person is able to find happiness even in the midst of personal tragedy, simply because they've been happy before. They know the feeling, so they're able to basically find it again.
Yeah, it's got a foundation that they
Right.
can get back to. Yeah. And he says, otherwise, we're going to be calling the same man, oh, he's got lots of goods, things are going well for him, he's happy. Oh, he lost his job, he lost, this, he's unhappy. But we do talk that way all the time. And he's saying that's not really the way to see it. That human excellence is not going to be subject to ups and downs of fortune like that. It's more permanent. You've really worked on it. And you can be knocked, as you said, you can be knocked for a loop for a while. But if it's got a strong foundation, you'll get it back.
So I guess where I was reading this was all these things that we consider to be part and parcel of being happy, the external things, they do count up to a point. But if you were to lose them all tomorrow, would you still be happy? And I personally think if you were happy before you got all those things, why not? Why wouldn't you be able to find it?
Yeah, right here, Aristotle really seems to be backing away from that external necessity, right? I mean, he says, fortune doesn't determine if you fare well or ill, but it's just an accessory. What really counts is that you, again, conform to virtue. So he's seems to me to really be dialing back on how important the external stuff is. So, but I'm still not sure if he's taken it away completely. I keep going back to that shoemaker analogy. What is the leather that you're making shoes of? What is the stuff out of which you're making happiness and virtue?
Well, especially because I'm thinking now of, one of the virtues he's going to talk about is generosity. And certainly, if you're a generous person, having a lot of things to be generous with, time, money, all those things is great. But if you're in a really constrained life, you may not have a lot to be generous with, but I guess the question is, are you, it's back to the widow's mite, right? Are you still going to give something even though you can't give much? You're not going to have a huge impact. Nobody's going to call you a benefactor to the state. You're not going to endow a university. But you might give to the people in your circle what you can, which won't be much. And he might still call that excellent, but he does hedge and say maybe that person wouldn't be supremely happy, though, because they don't have the instruments to fully practice their generosity. Just like that shoemaker, he'll make a pretty darn good shoe. But if you give him the real equipment and materials, he'll make an amazing shoe. And that would be
under the circumstances.
Yes. And that maybe he would call that, as he does at the end of this section, supremely happy, if you've got all the equipment. So you have the excellence and you have the equipment to be excellent with. Then you can really be a great shoemaker, a great harpist, a great humanitarian, right? If you don't have all those things, it does sound like he's saying you can still be happy. You can still conform your soul to virtue. You just won't have as much to work with. Okay, well, in the last few minutes here, are there things that he's brought up that you want to return to, or maybe sections we haven't looked at that you wish we had? He does skip by other people's definitions of happiness, sometimes based on pleasure, sometimes based on honor. We didn't talk much about those. I guess one thing I'd like to go to, and he'll address this again later, is people who say happiness is about having pleasant things happen to you, right? It's smiling. You're smiling, you're laughing. That's certainly how a lot of people define happiness. He brings this up in section 8 and says that actually those popular views about happiness confirm what he says, because happiness is pleasant and pleasurable. And this is around 1099A10. Maybe, Joe, would you read for us again there? The life of men active is also pleasant.
There. Okay.
Have you found it?
The life of men active in this sense is also pleasant in itself. For the sensation of pleasure belongs to the soul, and each man derives pleasure from what he is said to love. A lover of horses from horses, a lover of the theater from plays, and in the same way, a lover of justice from just acts, and a lover of virtue in general from virtuous acts. In most men, pleasant acts conflict with one another because they are not pleasant by nature. But men who love what is noble derive pleasure from what is naturally pleasant. Actions which conform to virtue are naturally pleasant, and as a result, such actions are not only pleasant for those who love the noble, but also pleasant in themselves. The life of such men has no further need of pleasure as an added attraction, but it contains pleasure within itself. We may even go so far as to state that the man who does not enjoy performing noble actions is not a good man at all. Nobody would call a man just who does not enjoy acting justly, nor generous who does not enjoy generous actions, and so on. If this is true, actions performed in conformity with virtue are in themselves pleasant.
Okay, let's stop there. Let's talk a bit about this, because he's focused so much on action that we've probably lost our common idea that happy people are laughing and enjoying and smiling. And he says they will be. That when you're performing noble actions, you're enjoying it. You're having a good time. And in fact, he wouldn't even call a man just who doesn't enjoy being just. So I'm gonna put James on the spot, since you named an excellent, an example of someone you consider an excellent human being. Is that excellent human being enjoying performing their noble actions, do you think?
I think so.
Mm-hmm.
But again, the whole kind of, goodness tending into maybe not being good for the doer. Is it always pleasant to be, let's just take the example of the caregiver. I mean, sometimes I remember when my kids were small, I still love them dearly, but sometimes it's like, oh my Lord, this is exhausting.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know, maybe it's a different kind of pleasure.
Oh,
It's not always like making me smile kind of pleasure,
mm-hmm.
but I'm happy because, I mean, in the case of my kids, I guess, I'm happy that I stuck with them and carried them around the house when they had earaches as babies or whatever, I mean,
Mm-hmm.
there's pleasure and there's pleasure, right? I mean, the pleasure there comes from being glad to take care of them and knowing that I feel like I did a good job,
Mm-hmm.
even though it wasn't pleasant.
Yeah. So that's a good point, that there are different kinds of pleasures. And, you know, people talk about this, especially with kids, the phrase easy now, hard later. If you give in to, you know, it's nice when your kid wants candy to give them candy, because then you're the fun parent. But it's hard later when you want them to eat healthy food and they won't. And, you know, now you've got a kid, you've got a problem. So it's one kind of pleasure to give kids what they want, and you're smiling and they're smiling, you're smiling. It's another to have to say no sometimes, and they're not smiling. And probably you're not smiling, but you're saying, James, in the long run, there's still the pleasure of feeling, well, I did right by that kid. I'm raising good kids, not giving in to every whim. I take pleasure in a noble action, even though it's hard at the time.
And so, yeah, it's sort of a higher pleasure, a higher kind of pleasure, perhaps, or a different kind than the immediate sensation, perception.
Well, and the example, it might have been you, James, gave before of eating cake or something, you know, that there's a part of us that desires to eat great food and takes pleasure in eating that food. But with ourselves, too, we have to curtail that immediate pleasure for the long-term pleasure of being healthy.
He doesn't really seem to say, though, how one gets to the point where you enjoy virtuous action. He says, I think in this paragraph we just read, that there's no faking it. If you don't enjoy the virtuous action you're undertaking, you're not really happy. But he doesn't give us much of a hint as to how you get to be the kind of a person who enjoys acting virtuously.
And do you have to be born that way, or
yeah,
the first 50 times, you know, or is it the first 50 times you do it, it isn't that pleasurable, but it becomes so?
I don't think he's very clear about that, but it's at some level that's the hard question. Do you just keep behaving virtuously until you like it? I don't know.
Yes. Yeah. Well, and the music example, I think, fits with the raising kids example. That practice, I think most musicians would say practice is a thing I have to do. They probably hated it quite a lot when they were younger, but they can see that it gives them the skill, and they love having that skill. So they endure the practice in order to get the skill. But I don't know if they would say they enjoy practice. Yeah. Well, as I said, we're already using language he's going to use a lot next week when he talks about habit, the importance of habit for being this kind of excellent human being. But I'm going to give you a piece of homework, which is think about, you know, James had one right to mind, but think about the people in your life that you might point out and say, well, there's an excellent human being. And ask yourself, is it about actions they're performing? And this question of, are they taking pleasure, and what kind of pleasure? Are they always happy doing these actions, or is there some part of them that endures a lot of this in order to get some later end? You know, I think a lot of parenting is that way, James, you're right. It's fun to give the kid a sucker, but we know it would be a mistake to do it all the time. Yeah. Okay, well, for next week, we are going to read book 2. And as I said, the focus there is on habit. And he's going to carry that focus throughout the rest of the book. You know, unlike Plato, he really feels like virtue is going to result in action. So we're not going to talk about virtue. We're going to do it. We're going to perform it. We're going to learn how to be more virtuous, to become more like an excellent human being. So it's going to be a very practical guidebook that he gives us. You can disagree with him, but that he's intending for it to be a very practical guidebook. Okay, so I will see you all next week. Same time, same place.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.